You're listening to episode 101 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness teachers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Michelle Gale joins us to speak about mindful parenting in a messy world. Hi everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I want to mention that I will be teaching a mindfulness-based stress reduction, or MBSR course, live online through the presentmomentmindfulness.com website starting in January. This is offered on a donation basis, not at a set cost, and will be held on Saturdays from noon to about 2:30 in the afternoon Eastern U.S. time. If you're interested in finding out more or applying for the course, details and links to apply will be posted on presentmomentmindfulness.com and on our social media presence. Hope you're able to join me and my co-teacher, Amy Ballantyne, in 2018. Life, it may be fair to say, can be complicated at times. There are circumstances that provide a continuous roller coaster ride of ups and downs, and learning to navigate those often tidal currents is part of the practice of mindfulness. Now, add onto that the dimensions inherent in being a caregiver for others, particularly children and their own flailing about, learning what it means to live in the world. What is a mindful parent to do? Michelle Gale is a mindfulness teacher, corporate trainer, executive coach, and podcast host. She's on a mission to support parents in staying meaningfully connected to themselves and their families, even as the demands and complexity of contemporary life and work are accelerated. She works in schools, communities, and corporations, teaching mindfulness and speaking to parents. Michelle was previously the head of learning and leadership development at Twitter and spent most of her career working in high-growth technology startups. She received her MA in psychology from Meridian University and her undergraduate degree from Florida State University, where she studied child development. She lives in San Francisco Bay Area with her husband, two sons, who are by far her greatest life teachers. Our guest today is Michelle Gale. Michelle, welcome to the podcast. Glad to be speaking with you.
Thank you for having me. How fun.
So before we get started on our actual topic for this podcast, I wanted us to talk for a few minutes about seeing you on stage in New York at the Town Hall at the Mindfulness in America conference. Tell us about that and how you found yourself in that spot.
I was not planning on going to the conference because I think I mentioned to you I was in the Search Inside Yourself teacher training here in San Francisco a few days, just days before. And so I decided to go quite last minute. And because I was going last minute, I'm a big part of the conference. I'm an advisor. I've been helping with program development for many years. Soren is one of my very dearest friends, the founder. And I didn't have anything to do while I was at the conference. I was just going to go help out wherever help is needed. And apparently while I was on an airplane arriving, the team decided that I would be doing most of the hosting because Soren had decided he didn't want to. So that was pretty much how I found myself there. It was a surprise. It was a fun surprise.
You did a wonderful job. And hopefully this leads to seeing you on stage at Wisdom 2.0 in California.
Yes, there is grumblings. There are grumblings of me hosting. I've never hosted the conference. I've always just done facilitation or spoke, but we'll see. More to come.
Well, let's get started on our actual interview for today's topic by having you tell us a little bit about your background. How'd you first encounter mindfulness? What's that journey been like?
Oh, wow. I first encountered it. I was in college and really struggling, feeling very disconnected to myself, very disconnected to my family at home. And I don't know how I ended up with a Thich Nhat Hanh book. I think it was Pieces Every Step, the name of the book. I believe it was Pieces Every Step. And I read that book and it really opened my eyes. I had taken a philosophy class. I went to community college before I transferred over to Florida State in Tallahassee, Florida. And I'd taken a philosophy class that just blew my mind. I'd never thought in those ways before. And so I read this book by Thich Nhat Hanh and ended up wanting to go on a bit of a quest, like a spiritual quest. I didn't know what that was, and I certainly didn't call it a quest then. I was just curious and interested, and I was raised Catholic, and I didn't want to go back to Catholicism. I knew, but I'd heard about a unity church in Tallahassee. So it was a non-denominational church, and that appealed to me. It was a Christian-based church, yet non-denominational, so it was open to all faiths. So I went there, and they have a meditation at each service. At least this church did in Tallahassee. And you would hold the person's hand of each person next to you, and I would sit, close to the front. And they would lead what I remember being at least 15 to 25 minutes of a guided meditation at each service. And I would just pour tears every time. I would just, that stillness and that silence, I would just cry and sob. And when it was over, just be sitting there and wonder, what is that? Like, what is going on? Like, why am I crying? I didn't even know why. So I went, I'll age myself, but I went to the church, store, and I bought some cassette tapes, which I'm sure you've heard of. I bought some cassette tapes. And so then I would use them at night. I had a lot of anxiety. I still do. I just don't take it very seriously anymore. But I had panic attacks back then, and a lot of anxiety and a lot of stress inside my body. So that was kind of my entry into it.
And I like that you brought up the anxiety is, it's still there. And maybe it's a change of relationship to it.
Very much a change of relationship to it. It is very much still there. Most mornings I wake up kind of, feeling that, oof, I have a very body focused anxiety. It's in my chest. It's in my belly. It's very visceral for me. And I wake up and I feel that and I say, okay, there you are, and we're going to lay here for a few minutes. And then we're going to get up and do our meditation, and we're going to sit here. And I think just doing that over and over and over again, over the years, and certainly in longer extended retreats. Yeah. And I remember John Kabat-Zinn, I was on retreat with him once, and somebody was asking, why is it important that we sit? Why can't we just practice mindfulness? Why can't we just be awake, in our lives and not have to do this, what we're doing right now?
Why do we have to exercise?
Yes. Why do we have to exercise? And he said, every time you sit your butt on that cushion or that chair or however you sit, your mind tells your body, we do this. This is something we do. And so I do that.
So from there, how did that grow? Because you've continued on with your practice, and that's manifested in other aspects of your life as well.
Yeah. Well, I didn't continue on with practice from then in college. I toyed with it. I feel like the path kind of poked out and said, hi, and I'd step a little toe on and be like, no, no, on and off for many years. It wasn't until I had my two children. I have two boys who are 14 and 10 right now. And at the time they were 4 and 6 months old. And I decided I was ready for a career change. I had worked in technology in the startup world for 10 years at that point. I was a recruiter I moved out to San Francisco on my own with my car and my cat. That story. That's not so rare here. And I was working in tech and loving it and having a great time, and decided it was time for something new. So I decided to go to a coaching school, New Ventures West. I wanted to do leadership coaching because I'd worked with so many leaders inside of organizations, and particularly startups. I was a startup girl. I still am mostly. I work in larger organizations now, but mostly startups. And there was just no support. And so I found myself doing unskillful coaching, and really ultimately what it was, what I understand now, was just that presence, being with them and really seeing them and hearing and listening. And there's healing, alone in that. And when I went through graduate school, I remember learning. I was very curious about the research around all the different kinds of therapies that existed. And what became very clear in the research was it doesn't matter often. Most of the time, it doesn't matter what kind of therapy. It's in the relationship. And when I hear relationship, I hear presence. So that was really what I was offering to them. And so I was looking for a school that was the focus. And I found New Ventures West, and sitting was a part of their program. So this is 10 years later now. I'm in my 30s, mid 30s, somewhere from my mid 20s. And I started sitting regularly. And the first time we sat there was horrible because I'd only ever done guided meditation. I had never done silent meditation. Mm-hmm. So when they said that we were going to meditate, they had us all sit in a circle, but turn around on the outside. And they started with and I thought, oh, this is no problem. I know how to do this. And we did some guided meditation for 20 minutes, and then everything got quiet. And my chest started pumping and my mind was going crazy. And I really wanted to run out of the room. It was so painful and horrible to sit with myself for another 20, 25 minutes. And it was over. I was like, I mean, it was like traumatic.
Yeah.
And it took me a long time. I was determined. I'm like, I don't know what that's all about. Just like I didn't know what it was all about at the church, so many years earlier. But I'm going to stay with this, and I'm going to make this work. And so 5 minutes at a time, 10 minutes at a time, 20 minutes, day longs, 5 days, week longs. So it took time for me. It was, really hard to sit with the chaos in my mind and the anxiety in my body. And I think just my history, my stories that I was carrying, that I was believing and committed to.
So from that, and let's get to our main topic. You have a book that's being released right about now, Mindful Parenting in a Messy World. What prompted you to put this together?
As I mentioned, I came to my regular practice when my boys were very young. And so naturally, for me anyway, my practice was very revolved around parenting. Even just being able to get practice in. I tell this story a lot. I was working with Wendy Palmer for many years doing somatic work. And I was bemoaning to her that I couldn't get my meditation time in. And she said, well, tell me about your schedule. And I'm like, well, there's this and that. And then there's nighttime. My kids won't let me. I have to stay in their room till they fall asleep. I can't leave. And she's like, yeah, there it is. I'm like, there's what? She said, that's when you're going to sit. So that was when I started. For years, I brought my cushion in their room, and that was the agreement. I would come and we'd snuggle, we'd have our little ritual, and then I'd sit, and that's how I'd get practice in. So it was revolved around really weaving practice in, sitting in those, picking them up for baseball practice. I would sit in the car and sit for 20 minutes. It didn't look the way you read it in the books. Like same time, same place,
right.
Everywhere. Sometimes if I woke up early, I did it early in the morning. But if I didn't, I'd just weave it in. So it was in how to practice. And it was also in just my daily life. Right. They were my practice. So in so many ways.
And I like that you titled this so appropriately, that life can be messy, that it's not always going to be picture perfect. It's this time on the clock. I will now be blissful for 45 minutes. Maybe not so much. And in fact, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the scheduling aspect, of course, as a parent, being so very busy and an active professional. Are you finding that it's easier for you to get your formal practice in, not necessarily on a cushion in full lotus, but being very present with whatever's happening, like sitting with your kids before they go to sleep? basing that less on what the clock says and more what's happening with, we're doing this thing right now, whatever time it is now is the time for us to do that. What's that been like for you?
It's evolved over the years, and honestly, it evolves from week to week. It depends on what's going on. I'm an early riser by nature, and my kids don't wake up so early anymore. They used to wake up at the crack of dawn, and that doesn't happen. So I really do get to practice in the mornings very often. And sometimes I don't, sometimes I don't wake up, or sometimes I decide I want to go exercise or whatever. And so I do it, like I said, very often dropping off and picking up. I go a little bit early and I close my eyes in my car and I just sit there. So the car is a big one for me. The mornings are a big one for me. I have a little office outside of on the back side of our main house that's only new since April. And that's been really nice because I can escape even in the middle of the day and come out, even if it's just for 10 minutes. And sometimes I sit for 40 minutes and sometimes I sit for 10 minutes, and I'm very committed to, now my kids are older, they're 14 and 10. So for extended retreats, I don't know if you've read Richie Davidson and Dan Goleman's new book, Altered Traits, yet. But the research seems to be pointing to these extended retreats being really supportive, and not that daily practice is important and wonderful. And, those extended retreats are like super powered.
Yeah, absolutely. I found that in my own practice as well.
Yeah.
Have your children done any of the practice with you? Have they been curious about that, seeing mom doing this and what it's like for you?
Well, that again is up and down. They've been around it, since they were very little with me. I taught in their school for a few years. That's actually how I started teaching mindfulness. I wasn't planning on teaching mindfulness, just like I wasn't planning on emceeing the wisdom conference. I went through the Mindful Schools program so I could teach my kids at home. I wanted to be able to weave practices in at home, and ended up teaching at their school for 3 years, kindergarten through 5th grade, a little bit in the middle school, and working with all the teachers on weaving it into the classroom, and really beautiful. So my kids got it from me at their school for 3 years, right? So they got formal practice, the Mindful Schools curriculum, for 3 years with me. And at home, we'll sit for like a minute, I'll go a minute or two. I don't really invite them unless they want to. I don't ask them to do formal practice. But the way I see it weaving in at home is much more around compassion and pausing before we eat, pausing before we leave the house. We have a gratitude jar, that we use on and off. There's a story. I don't think I've told this to anybody on my podcast yet, but this is a good example of how I see it showing up in my home. My youngest son, Brody, who's 10, was sitting around the table with some friends a few weekends ago, maybe a month or two ago. And a boy was telling a story about how this day was the day his baby sister had died at childbirth, like 10 years ago or something, a long time ago, maybe even before he was born. And so he's telling Brody and his other friend this story. And I'm standing in the kitchen like, whoa, this is happening right now. And they're listening very intently and listening to his story. And Brody, my son, out of the blue says, I know just what to do. And he said, we're going to send her love. And his other friend said, I don't know how to do that. And he said, well, I'll show you. Everybody put your hand on your heart, and close your eyes. And he started sending her wishes and love. And then the boy whose sister it would have been said, I think she would have loved bicycles. And so they're sending her bicycles. And the other boy said, let's send her an electric bicycle. And they're sending her electric bicycles. And then it was just over, and they went back to eating and went on their day. For me, I sat in the kitchen trying not to cry, not cry.
Yeah.
And just felt like, oh, yes. And later in the day, I was able to sit him down alone and say, Brody, I'm so proud of you. You really knew what to do. Like, that was exactly the thing to do. It was to pause, to put your hand on your heart, to send love, to be present. You blow me away, that you knew to do that. And he's done those kinds of things before. So that's where I know it's working. I'm putting my fingers up in parentheses, the practice is just kind of coming through.
Thank you for sharing that story. It was really very, very touching. And I can only imagine as a parent overhearing that spontaneous moment How moving that must have been for you.
So moving, so moving. And yeah, just this deep, gratitude and peace, within myself, knowing that that is coming through him
Yeah.
is so dear.
So, looking at the flip side of mindful parenting, some of the challenges that you
Oh,
run into,
hard.
what are some of the things that have been a challenge to you most in your own practice of mindful parenting?
Well, I'm a recovering yeller. I always I am a recovering yeller. It can be really hard, when your temper raises and when you get triggered. So I am always working with my own triggers, and I do a lot of Byron Katie work. I do a lot of inquiry work and sitting with that and journaling. And, I can get triggered. There's some pretty, what I would consider awful stories, of when I lost it. However, I also have always apologized and recovered. And I think that's makes for stronger relationships. So not that I want to sit here and just berate myself, but relationships are tough and parenting is hard and your life is not your own so often of the times. And it's if we don't investigate our minds regularly, it could get really ugly in the parent-child relationship. And it's been hard for me on and off over the years when things are really tough at home, particularly when my kids are fighting, when there's a lot of bickering going on between my boys. That's a huge trigger for me. Really hard for me to stay grounded when I'm being ungrateful, when I get the sense they're entitled or ungrateful. And they are entitled. Entitled. And then I'm like, oh God, this is the conditions we've created for them. We've got to always look back on ourselves. Well, yeah, of course they're self-centered. Well, they're supposed to be in a lot of ways developmentally, but also, they have everything, they have everything they need. So, right now we have a lot of fires going on in California. So I'm being very intentional to include my kids. My youngest son just went to the grocery store with my husband. My older son and his friend are going to cook for the firemen. We dropped clothes off and towels this morning. And, so making sure that they serve. It's one of my biggest complaints at my son's school is I don't think there's enough focus on service. And I realize that's also our responsibility too. But I think particularly for so many of us who have children who live very privileged lives. And privilege doesn't necessarily, they're not going on private jets or anything, but they're privileged. Really, they have everything they need. They don't need for anything that matters. And so for me, I can, that's an important piece for me because I can get really ugly when I perceive them as being entitled. And so my work is to include that in our lives.
So, for other parents who may be picking up the book and going through it, what are you most hoping that they notice as oh, yeah, that moment?
That's a good question. That in those moments that the poop is hitting the fan, when things are really hard, that they go through a few cycles of seeing, oh, that was actually the best learning, right? That was when, we were able to do the best the best reconnection afterwards, right? So it's that in these times of messiness, we can keep that little bit of awareness that, oh, and this too, right, is going to support my growth and development as a human being. So not that we're going to do it perfectly. And also, if I could also have a wish for parents, through my book is that they let go of the guilt, that they begin to become aware of that, how hard they are on themselves and how that's normal to us as human beings, but that there's another way.
That you get to be human while learning from the times where we're maybe not at our best.
Yeah. And they also see their children as teacher. I mean, they are the teachers. They are there. There's a great quote. I wish I could remember it exactly, but it's something to the effect of, our children will awaken every unmet need, everything we've not, resolved from our history and our family life, they will bring it up over and over again for us. It's their gift to us.
Michelle, is there anything else you want to share with the listeners?
I say something at the end I have a podcast as well, and I say something at the end of each one of my podcasts. And I say, may you meet this moment fully. May you meet this moment with kindness towards yourself and others. And that, I think, is the work of parenting mindfully, is to meet this moment fully and be kind to ourselves and be kind to others.
Thank you for that. For folks who are listening, you can find out more about Michelle and her work. We have several links that we'll be putting on the episode page for this episode, including michellegale.com and mindfulparentingbook.com. Michelle, thank you so much for being here.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.